Thanks for coming out on a weekday daytime, which we thought you might be. Welcome to Book Passage. As always, we thank you for supporting independent bookstores like this one. By your presence here, if you have a cell phone, if you can check that while I make a couple of announcements. Make sure it's on silent or turned off. Everyone around will appreciate that. And while you're checking your devices, if you haven't had a chance to pick up a copy of Niall's latest book, it's available at all the registers that you passed on your way in this afternoon, and in about an hour, after some presentation and some Q&A, you'll have a chance to pick up a copy, and once you pay for it, bring it on back in here, and our guest will be signing at the table he's sitting at the moment. There goes the phone that goes off. If you're like me, if you were draft age during the Vietnam War, you had certain strong but limited opinions of the people who seem to have your fate in their hands. Among them LBJ and Richard Nixon, and the subject of today's book. But this is the age of the new biographies. It's not going very well for Richard Nixon, but there is Robert Caro and the LBJ books, the LBJ volumes, and this gentleman today, one of our best historians, beginning his work on Henry Kissinger, someone whom we think we know a lot about, and as you'll find out, in point of fact, in a lot of ways, we don't, except for the limited public persona that he was. And he was known as everything from Super K, the indispensable man, to, as some of you probably remember, Dr. Strangelove from the movie, and everything in between. And it's quite a personal story, as you'll find out, and everybody from Nelson Rockefeller to JFK to the aforementioned Mr. Nixon sought this man's advice. So this is volume 1 of an extensive biography of Kissinger, The Idealist. I'm just going to read briefly from a review by John Lewis Gaddis from Yale University, who says in part, always thorough, often surprising, at times deeply moving, this is an extraordinary biography of one of the most significant scholar, statesman, strategists of our time by one of our most accomplished historians, not to be missed. Our guest is Niall Ferguson. He is the Lawrence Tisch Professor of History at Harvard and a Senior Research Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford down the peninsula. He is also the author of the New York Times bestsellers, The Great Degeneration, Civilization, The Ascent of Money, and The War of the World. Would you please give a nice big warm welcome for Niall Ferguson.
Thank you very much indeed for that lovely introduction. I love independent bookstores, and I love to come to places like this and talk with audiences like this. It's just a huge pleasure. There's only one fly in the ointment. I was just told that this is the 40th anniversary of Book Passage, which makes this bookstore younger than me, and I find that a little painful to admit. When you expect students to be younger than you, of course, but bookstores. I'm going to talk a bit about this book and then invite your questions. I'm more interested in having a discussion than delivering a lecture. But I think in order to kick the discussion off, I should tell you a little bit about why I came and how I came to write the biography of Henry Kissinger. The term authorized biography is very off-putting. And I've always thought, whenever I've heard it, whitewash, hagiography. So it's very important that I clarify right at the outset my relationship with Henry Kissinger. Because this book was his idea. We met in London, I think it was in 2003, and of all things, a cocktail party. And in my first conversation with him, he revealed that he had read one of my books. That is the right way to get on good terms with an academic, should you ever need to. So I was feeling suitably flattered until L. Macpherson walked into the room, and he immediately disappeared and reappeared beside her. Never seen anyone move so fast. Subsequent to that initial encounter, we had a correspondence. I was at that time based at Oxford, or at least I was transitioning from Oxford to the US. And he came up with the idea of my writing his biography. I know I was not the first person approached to do this, and I in fact said no. And I said no for a couple of reasons. One, I knew it would be incredibly difficult. I was dead right about that. I knew there would be an absolutely huge pile of material, not just his private papers, but also a massive material in government archives and private archives all around the world. And I also knew, at least I thought I knew, that Christopher Hitchens would write a vicious review of my book. Well, I was wrong about that, because sadly, Hitchens, whom I knew and was a great friend of my wife's, died before I finished the book. And I have to say, I wish he were here, because I'd love to read that review, no matter how coruscating it was. Why did I change my mind? Well, let me introduce you to the diplomacy of Henry Kissinger. Here's a good quote from a few letters of his, in order to give you a flavour of the book, because quotations are really the lifeblood of good history. He wrote to me after I had declined to write the book, and I'm not going to do the voice. What a pity. I received your letter just as I was hunting for your telephone number to tell you of the discovery of files I thought had been lost. 145 boxes which had been placed in a repository in Connecticut by a groundkeeper who's since died. These contain all my files, writings, letters, sporadic diaries, at least to 1955, together with some 20 boxes of private correspondence from my government service. Be that as it may, our conversations have given me the confidence, after admittedly some hesitation, that you would have done a definitive, if not necessarily positive, evaluation. You begin to understand why this man was a very successful diplomat. I bit on the fly a bit like a fish in a river, was hooked within a week or two, was in Connecticut reading papers, letters from those very boxes. And so within minutes of doing that, I realized I had to do this book. Let me just give you an example of one of the letters that I saw that first day of research. It was a letter from Henry Kissinger to his parents, dated July 1948. There is not only right or wrong, but many shades in between. The real tragedies in life are not in choices between right and wrong, because only the most callous of persons choose what they know to be wrong. Real dilemmas are difficulties of the soul, provoking agonies. I was hooked, but I also knew that I should avoid being reeled in. So I said to him, okay, I'll take this on, but on condition that you have no say over what I write. I will write what I find. I will strive to write what I think is the truth. Wie es eigentlich gewesen, as it essentially was, in Ranker's famous phrase. I will look not only in your papers, but I will look in as many archives as I can get to try to get this story straight. But you're going to have to accept that it will not all be to your credit, because whose life is without its warts? So we agreed that on that basis I'd go ahead. There was one caveat, and that was that correspondence relating to his family I'd only be able to quote from with his approval. So personal stuff. And I agreed to that. And I'm glad I did. Because it was a power he made very little use of, except with regard to his first marriage. I went through divorce as I was writing this book over 10 years. And I came to understand exactly why one would not want every sentence of every letter relating to one's first marriage in the public domain. But in fact, in the end, there were really only 3 sentences that did make it into the final published edition, 3, and they related to his first marriage. And I therefore, full disclosure, did make those 3 concessions. Everything else, including a lot of things that Henry Kissinger is not comfortable with, are in the book. 10 years later, I think I've gathered and included in my database nearly 10,000 documents. We figured out, my wonderful researcher Jason and I, that it was nearly 38,000 pages from 111 archives, 50 of which are specifically used in this book. This is volume 1. There will be a second volume. Volume 1 is the first half of his life. So from 1923 to the end of 68, actually just into 69. And it therefore does not cover his time as National Security Advisor to Richard Nixon and Secretary of State to Nixon and Ford. I'm very happy for you to ask me questions about that later period, but I will not be able to give you definitive answers because I haven't finished the research and I haven't processed the material. And maybe this is a good opportunity for me to talk a bit about my methods as a historian. Somewhere there ought to be a ratio available about all works of history. The ratio of pages read or words read to pages or words written. There are a great many books about Henry Kissinger and about US foreign policy in the 1970s. But the ratios of words read to words written can be quite low. Some cases, I suspect, below unity. This is a book with a very high ratio of words read to words written, even although it's a pretty long book, close to 1,000 pages. I have sought to immerse myself in not only his own correspondence, but a great deal of other correspondence, and a great deal of other writing, some published but most unpublished, relating to his times. And my goal has been not just to write about his life, but to contextualize it at every stage. You might ask yourself a question: why bother writing about the first half of his life? Surely the meat is in the second half, and in particular in the 1970s. Well, my view is that one cannot understand what happened after 1968 until one has understood the man who was born in Fürth, Franconia, in southern Germany in 1923, who was 10 years old, or attained his 10th year under Adolf Hitler, who was a refugee from Nazi Germany in 1938. Refugees are much in the news these days. Kissinger's were refugees. They were amongst the relatively lucky few who were able to get visas under the US quota system at that time, because they had a distant relative in the United States who vouched for them. And they therefore found themselves in the fall of 1938 in New York City with nothing much, with really the possessions they'd been able to carry with them and a crate of furniture. That story, the story of the refugee, is something that has really not been told before. Walter Isaacson did a bit, and unlike me, had the advantage of being able to interview Kissinger's mother. But there's a lot more here based on documents, some of them dating back to Kissinger's time as a teenager in Germany. To give you a flavor of why this book, at least from my vantage point, illuminates the man, let me quote from a letter written 6 years after his arrival in the United States. Written in November 1944, when he was in a US uniform, having been drafted, on the edge of the German-controlled Siegfried Line in Germany. This is to his parents. And it's a letter that I only got to see a few months ago. Because this was one of the letters that Kissinger thought very hard about whether or not to let me see it. And I spent a great deal of time trying to persuade him that these letters, these family letters, would really help us understand him better than almost anything. I was right. It is very late, and I haven't much time, but I must write a letter, just so that I can affix to it the legend, somewhere in Germany. So I have made it, by the way. This is in English. Kissinger switched to writing even to his parents in English after arriving in the US. And although he continued, of course, to be able to speak German, whenever asked to do so in later life, he would always avoid it on the ground that he spoke teenage German. He was asked if he'd like to give a speech in the 1950s in German, and he said he would prefer to do it in English because he could discuss a football game, a soccer game in German very easily, but questions of nuclear strategy he tended to think about in English. Out in the darkness that envelopes this town, rows and rows of shattered buildings line the roads. People wander through the ruins. War has come to Germany. So I am back where I wanted to be. I think of the cruelty and the barbarism those people out there in the ruins showed when they were on top, and then I feel proud and happy to be able to enter here as a free American soldier. These letters are, at least to me, electrifying. And there's a sequence of them written to his parents in New York from successive battlefields. There's an extraordinary account of his experience during the Battle of the Bulge, when he came perilously close to being captured by the Germans and was certainly shelled extremely heavily by them. If he'd been captured, he'd almost certainly have been shot. The Germans gave short shrift to soldiers they captured who had been born in Germany, particularly if they were Jewish. In addition to experiencing combat at first hand, Kissinger also witnessed the liberation of a concentration camp. A small one outside Hanover, but as hideous as any of the larger death camps further east. And I want to quote from a short essay he wrote a little time after that experience, because it's another, to me, electrifying or illuminating document about his early life. He addresses this short essay entitled The Eternal Jew to a Polish inmate. Picture this young man, emaciated, close in fact to death, in those hideous prisoners' uniforms. Folek Sama, your foot has been crushed so that you can't run away. Your face is 40, your body is ageless, yet your birth certificate reads 16. And I stand there with my clean clothes and make a speech to you and your comrades. Folek Sama, humanity stands accused in you. I, Joe Smith, human dignity, everybody has failed you. You should be preserved in cement up here on the hillside for future generations to look upon and take stock. Human dignity, objective values have stopped at this barbed wire. What differentiates you and your comrades from animals? Why do we in the 20th century countenance you? Yet, Folek, you are still human. You stand before me and tears run down your cheek. Hysterical sobbing follows. Go ahead and cry, Folek Sama, because your tears testify to your humanity, because they will be absorbed in this cursed soil, dedicating it. As long as conscience exists as a conception in this world, you will personify it. Nothing done for you will ever restore you. You are eternal in this respect. This is not the Henry Kissinger you encountered in the 1970s and the 1980s, in the books written about him by others like Christopher Hitchens. This is a very different man. And we have to understand this young Kissinger, I think, if we're able to understand the mature Kissinger of the second volume. Let me give you one more letter, and then offer you a few concluding reflections on what I think this book tells us. February 1946, Kissinger decides not to return to the United States immediately, not to demobilize, but in fact to stay in occupied Germany and to switch to a teaching job at a military school. He writes to his parents who are wondering why he's not coming home or coming to the US. You'll never understand it, and I would never explain it except in blood and misery and hope. Sometimes when I look down our table and see the empty spaces of our good and capable men, the men that should be here to nail down what we fought for, I think of the night Hitler's death was announced. That night, Bob Taylor and I agreed that no matter what happened, no matter who weakened, we would stay to do in our little way what we could to make all previous sacrifices meaningful. We would stay just long enough to do that. I called this book The Idealist. That's the subtitle of Volume 1, not of Volume 2. I don't know what the subtitle of Volume 2 will be. Because I want to convey that the young Kissinger, partly for reasons of personal experience and partly for reasons of intellectual development, is much better understood as an idealist than as the arch realist we're used to thinking about. When I set out to write the book, before I'd really done the research at all, I thought I might call it something like American Machiavelli. That was my working title. And then I realized that Kissinger had almost nothing to do with Machiavelli, and nor was he an American Bismarck. In fact, the young Kissinger is striking for his distance from realism in all its senses. Let me suggest to you 3 ways in which he's much better understood as an idealist. The first is that when he thought about the history of the 1930s that had plunged his family into such an abyss, forced them into emigration, and then catapulted him back into the biggest war in all of human history, he regarded the policy of appeasement as a classic example of a failed realism. Realism in the sense of hard-headed pursuit of the national interest. In an interesting lecture I came across in his papers, he says that men of the 1930s, thinking of Chamberlain and Baldwin, the British leaders associated with appeasement, thought of themselves, quote, as hard-headed realists, because they thought that they could handle Hitler as just another German nationalist. They underestimated the massive threat posed by National Socialism as an ideology. So for Henry Kissinger in the 1950s at least, realism was not a complimentary term. Secondly, at Harvard, where he came under the influence of a rather bombastic Southern professor of government called William Yandell Elliott, Kissinger immersed himself in the philosophy of idealism. It's quite a funny story for professors. The young Kissinger, back from the war, at that strange Harvard, full of men aged by experience, suddenly transferred back into undergraduate life. Kissinger turns up and says to William Yandell Elliott, "I'm your tutee." Elliott was a busy man. He liked to run between Cambridge and Washington. He fancied himself an advisor to politicians too. In order to get rid of Kissinger, Elliott said, "Well, go and read the works of Immanuel Kant." This is the kind of thing you would say in the expectation that you would never see the student again. But Kissinger being Kissinger, he went and read the works of Immanuel Kant and much else besides. And at the end of his undergraduate career, having persuaded Eliot that he was for real, he wrote a senior thesis, the longest in Harvard history. In fact, it's the origin of a rule limiting the length of theses, with the modest title, The Meaning of History. The meaning of history is almost unreadable. But I plowed through it and realized that what I was reading was a carefully reasoned critique of Kant's philosophy, and particularly his philosophy of history, the central point of which is that freedom is an experience of the mind, that we are not the prisoners of great historical forces that lead us inexorably onwards to some divinely known destination, perpetual peace, or whatever other nirvana you like. We are free, and our freedom consists of meaningful choices. It is something we live in our heads. So Kissinger became an idealist philosophically, not least because Eliot, who'd studied at Oxford under Lindsay, one of the great British idealist philosophers, saw himself in combat with the pragmatists who had been the dominant force at the Harvard faculty in the previous 2 generations. The third reason I called this book The Idealist is that as he emerged from his philosophical study and began to think about foreign policy, Kissinger came to the realization that the Cold War was not just about economics. As an idealist, he rejected materialist theories of history, including the Marxism-Leninism on which the Soviet system was based, but he also rejected capitalist materialist theories. Those people who said, we'll win the Cold War by having a more efficient economic system than the Soviets, Kissinger repudiated. He said, quote, "It was dangerous to allow an argument about democracy to become a discussion of the efficiency of economic systems. The inward intuition of freedom," this is such a key quotation, so if you're drifting, looking at the sunshine, wishing you were outside, let me regain your attention for this. "The inward intuition of freedom would reject totalitarianism even if it were economically more efficient." That's an awfully important insight. In Volume 2, I've got to grapple with the way the Cold War unfolded in the 1970s and 1980s. Most people, probably most people in this room, now think it was won on economics. This is a very widespread belief about the Cold War, that their system failed and ours succeeded, end of story. I think this is wrong. I think it is wrong, and I think that Kissinger's insight, the Cold War was about ideas of freedom versus ideas of unfreedom that ultimately could not be legitimate, was of enormous importance. Let me leave you with 4 simple thoughts about what I learned from writing this first half of Kissinger's life. The first is, and I'm simply going to sum up his thinking, that history is to states what character is to humans, to individuals. And if you do not understand history, you cannot understand the actions of, say, a foreign power. Imagine trying to deal with President Putin today knowing no Russian history, or with Xi Jinping knowing no Chinese history. Kissinger's point's a simple one. Those who want to engage in foreign policy must know history. And one reason I was tempted to write the book was that here was a case of an historian. His PhD is about the Congress of Vienna in the early 19th century, entering the realm of power and making at least a fist of foreign policy making. It's rare. Second point, the problem of conjecture. When you take a decision, and this applies in business as much as in foreign policy, but for Kissinger it was a strategic decision, you may have to do difficult things in the short run to avoid a great disaster in the future. The problem is that if you're successful and you avoid the disaster, there's not much gratitude. People are very, very thankless for catastrophes that don't happen. And so the temptation is not to do anything difficult, but always to take the line of least resistance, or as we say today, to kick the can down the road. You might get lucky. Maybe there won't be a disaster and people will say you're a great statesman, but you may be wrong. And his favourite case to illustrate this point is 1938. They thought they were great realists. They gambled on inaction in the hope that Hitler was just a regular nationalist. They found to their cost, the cost in fact of 50 million lives, that he was in fact a genocidal maniac. So the problem of conjecture, as he calls it, is a central idea in Kissinger's early thought. Third point, most choices in foreign policy are between evils. It is a moral act to choose the lesser of two evils. There are seldom nice Boy Scout options that will make you feel 100% good about your decision. And finally, and perhaps most surprisingly, pure realism of the sort that Bismarck stood for is in fact a not viable, a non-viable strategy, because it cannot have the moral underpinning that ultimately legitimates policy. I found in Kissinger's papers an unpublished book on Bismarck, unfinished and unpublished, that illustrated a point that I'd come to understand already. For Kissinger, Bismarck's realism, his cynicism, his readiness to do whatever it took for the Prussian royal interest, was not sustainable. It's a critique of Bismarck, not a celebration. And for those reasons, I do think that this book makes an important contribution. And I do not believe that calling it The Idealist was just one of those provocations that I have sometimes been accused of. This is not just to make readers of the New York Times spill their granola in horror. It's because I think it's true. And that whatever comes in Volume 2, whatever I end up calling it, we need to understand the early Kissinger, the first half of this man's life, and understand that he thought of himself as an idealist before we can begin to understand what came next. Thank you very much indeed. Questions? Gentleman in the blue shirt is first.
Yeah. What do we know about Kissinger's idealism as it related to the early to mid 50s with the rising threat of a nuclear-armed Soviet Union and the hegemony of the communist Chinese as that was growing up? I'm curious what you learned about that period.
I think for many of Kissinger's generation, the transition from World War II to World War III, to the Cold War, was pretty seamless. Kissinger actually encountered the Red Army firsthand on the banks of the River Elbe at the moment of German collapse. And there's a rather wonderful letter back to his parents about what the Russians are actually like when you get up close. Pretty scary. Kissinger quickly, as a student and then graduate student, recognized that the Soviet Union posed a mortal threat to freedom in its immediate vicinity, but even further afield. And so I think one has to recognize that the early Kissinger is a fairly classic Cold Warrior of the late 40s and 1950s. This was perhaps the least original thing about him. Much of the early writing is pretty closely aligned with what many contemporaries were saying in different ways. Like George Kennan, for example, Kissinger framed his understanding of communism with his understanding of Russian history. But broadly speaking, his critique, his analysis of the Soviet system was a fairly standard one. And he also subscribed to the domino theory that Eisenhower made famous, that if you let one country go communist, its neighbors would be next. So far, so unoriginal. What catapulted Kissinger to fame was his analysis of the nuclear problem. In 1957, he published a book entitled Nuclear Weapons and Foreign Policy. You're probably wondering how a guy who knew a lot about the Congress of Vienna would ever come to write a book about nuclear strategy. Well, it came about because he couldn't get tenure at Harvard. This has been known to happen. In those days, it was almost normal. He'd annoyed enough people in the government department not to be a pushover. Adam Ulam hated him. And so Eliot found him a job at the Council on Foreign Relations. working on one of the study groups at the council, which happened to be on nuclear strategy. Kissinger went from being the rapporteur, taking the minutes, to writing the book. He basically took the project over from the experts around the table. And the book made him famous. It's a book that makes a Dr. Strangelove sounding argument. And I think this is why he's sometimes been identified with the Peter Sellers character in the Kubrick movie. But it's the wrong identification, as I'll explain. In the book, Kissinger argues that we need another choice. If the Eisenhower strategy was massive retaliation or nothing, a binary choice, we either blow up the world or we let the Soviets do what they're doing, there needed to be some other option, or US policy would be trapped because there were so many issues, so many countries, so many places in the third world that the Soviets could make a move that wouldn't be a move in, that wouldn't be worth blowing the world up for. So nuclear weapons and foreign policy says we need to have the option to threaten limited nuclear war. Something short of Armageddon, but the use, say, of tactical or battlefield weapons to deter Soviet conventional forces. After all, the Red Army was much larger than the US Army. So that argument made him a celebrity because it was, at one level, shocking, but at the same time, persuasive. And it coincided in 1957 with a spasm of anxiety in the United States that the Soviets might, in fact, be catching up, technologically as well as in other ways. Sputnik suddenly crystallized this anxiety. It also produced the missile gap panic. So Kissinger becomes a celebrity making the argument that the Soviets are a serious threat. They could even catch up with the United States. And the United States needs to have some other strategic option than massive retaliation, which was the essence of the Eisenhower strategy. That's a rather long answer to your question, but it gets to the heart of an important point. How did a guy who knew about early 19th century diplomacy become a public intellectual on TV? There's some wonderful early TV Kissinger that I quote from in the book, but it's almost worth going on the links and the footnotes to see the young Kissinger explaining on TV, on Face the Press, what it is that his book implies for US foreign policy. In many ways, he dialed that back. Almost within a matter of months, he rethought the argument out of fear that a limited nuclear war would escalate to Armageddon, whatever you did. But it's interesting that the theory carried on, had a kind of life of its own, and became the basis for NATO and Warsaw Pact military planning. Both sides ended up with a whole arsenal of battlefield nukes. They were never used, but that doesn't mean the theory didn't have validity. So that's a short history of Henry Kissinger as Dr. Strangelove, except it turns out that he's not the inspiration. Kubrick was actually inspired by Herman Kahn rather than Henry Kissinger when they came up with the character. And if you actually watch the movie, you realize that the whole point about the way Sellers plays it is that Dr. Strangelove is a former Nazi, so he's also Ferner Braun, not a Jewish refugee. Yes, please.
Did you, I'm sure you saw I think it was a CNN movie on Kissinger going back to Germany and all the time. I thought that was good. But my real question has to do with the time and the anti-Semitism during Franklin Roosevelt's time and maybe Cordell Hull and all that. Did you, which was, of course, as we all know, absent in terms of decisions that would have helped at all. But did Kissinger, considering he was Jewish, considering he came from there, did you find him writing about or commenting on that period of the Democrats? And did you?
Interestingly, Kissinger wrote. I'm so sorry. Yes. The question has to do with the role of anti-Semitism in the United States in the 1930s as a factor in decision making then in Washington. And I think it's a very difficult question to answer because Kissinger wrote relatively little about the 1930s and almost nothing about US domestic politics. He preferred to think in 19th century terms, and allusions to the 1930s are very few and far between. His project as an academic was to write a trilogy. Part one was going to be the fall of Napoleon and the creation of a restored Europe. That was written and published as A World Restored. Part two was going to be Bismarck and the unification of Germany. He only wrote an essay about that. The book, which I found in his papers, was never published. And then there was part three that never even got written, which was the origins of World War I. Kissinger saw that as the period that repaid the closest study. He wrote relatively little about the origins of World War II and almost nothing about the US domestic situation. As you doubtless all know, there was a strong isolationist sentiment in the United States in the 1930s, and remarkably little appetite for intervention in World War II. After all, intervention in World War I had not been regarded as a tremendous success by Americans in the aftermath of Woodrow Wilson's presidency. So when Kissinger arrived in the United States in the late summer, early fall of 1938, he arrived in a country in which it was still perfectly possible for public figures, Charles Lindbergh, for example, to say really quite shocking things about the Jews, implying that there was legitimacy to European fascism and that indeed that might be applicable in the United States too. I mean, Roth's Plot Against America, which some of you will have read, is not a flight of fancy by any means. The opinion polls show tremendous reluctance to be drawn into the conflict. And although people felt sympathy for German Jews when they read about atrocities against them, especially after the pogrom of November 1938, Roosevelt had a tremendous struggle in his hands to persuade Americans that they should play a part in the war. So for me, the striking thing is that Kissinger arrives in the United States expecting to encounter a land of tolerance and freedom. But it certainly was that compared with Nazi Germany. But as I try to show in the book, New York City 1938 was not an entirely hospitable place for a German Jewish refugee. There were parts of town, particularly the German parts of town, you didn't go into. Yes, sir.
Hi. If you could find a new Kissinger for today, how do you think he'd handle Putin and his adventures in Europe?
Great question. And one that I will attempt to answer, although of course it takes me well out of the scope of this book. There are a couple of things going on right now that certainly look odd from the vantage point of Kissinger's time in government. One of the first things that he and Richard Nixon set out to do was to drive the Soviets out of the Middle East as major players and prevent them becoming power brokers, prevent them specifically exploiting their relationship with Syria and Egypt to the disadvantage of the United States and its allies. And they were very successful in that. Indeed, it's one of the first big wins of 1970 that they really outmaneuver the Soviets over the Jordan crisis. The other thing that's relevant here is the great insight, one of the most important of Kissinger's life, that you can exploit the division between Russia, or rather the Soviet Union, and China to the advantage of American foreign policy. This book reveals the true origin of the opening to China, and I think I'm the first person to have done this. There's usually a debate about whether Kissinger had the idea first or Nixon. They both got the idea from a Czech that you have never heard of, a man named Antonin Snyderek, who was a Prague professor. I think he was also involved in Czech intelligence too, who said to Kissinger, when Kissinger visited Prague in 1967, and then I think he said it to Nixon too, when Nixon separately visited Prague, you need to exploit this split between the Chinese and the Russians, but you need to align yourself with Mao against the Soviets. You need to take advantage of the fact that Mao hates the Soviet system and is a nationalist as much as he's a communist. And when Kissinger first hears this, he's incredulous, because Mao is seen as a crazy man. A cultural revolution is getting underway, China looks like it's going crazy, but ultimately this idea becomes absolutely crucial to US strategy, produces the opening to China in 1972, which is the single biggest move in the whole Cold War chess game. Okay, fast forward to 2015. What are we doing? One, we've allowed the Russians to become power brokers in the Syrian civil war, which is, by Kissingerian standards, a pretty rookie error. Two, we've allowed the Russians and Chinese to get closer to one another than either is to us, which undoes the 1972 policy, reverses it. Now, if I had 20 minutes more, I could give you a full-blown critique of what I think is wrong with President Obama's strategy.
Don't worry.
10 minutes then.
I'll give you the 5-minute version. It's not that Obama is weak. This is a misreading that one keeps getting from Republican candidates for the Republican nomination. He's actually very ruthless. He's capable of doing things that, if Christopher Hitchens was still with us, could be turned into the trial of Barack Obama. I mean, think of the drone strikes. The use of drones for targeted assassination is something that Amnesty International certainly regards as in violation of international law. Think of the way in which we've handled Egypt. While nobody was paying too much attention, a democratically elected president, Mohamed Morsi, was not only deposed in a military coup, but he was sentenced to death, the sentence confirmed this year, along with death sentences for about 90 other Muslim Brotherhood leaders. US military aid to Egypt was restored in April this year. Now, I don't really know what the difference between General Pinochet and General Sisi is. If one asks the question, what is our policy in Egypt today, and what was our policy in Chile in 1973, there seem to me some distinct common features. So I don't think President Obama is a weak president. I think, in fact, he can be extremely ruthless. But I think strategically, he's making a couple of very major mistakes. Probably the most important of these is the belief that he can achieve equilibrium in the Middle East by tilting the balance of power there in the favor of Iran. That, I think, has been the policy for some time. If one goes back to an interview that he did in the New Yorker magazine with David Remnick early in 2014, he made it quite clear, it's one of the rare occasions when Obama talked openly about his strategy, that the goal of US policy was to achieve equilibrium, which would be achieved by tilting towards Iran. The problem about this, it seems to me, is that you might get equilibrium, but I give it a 2% probability. You're much more likely to get escalating conflict as the Sunni powers in the region seek to preempt the advent of a nuclear Iran. So for some time I've been arguing that we're in the midst of a rapid escalation of conflict that starts 2011. Since 2010, battlefield fatalities have increased by a factor of 4, nearly all in the Middle East and North Africa, mostly in Syria. Terrorist casualties have gone up by a factor of 6 worldwide, again mostly in this region. And our policy, which is supposed to bring about equilibrium, I think is bringing about a really rapid escalation of sectarian conflict. And frankly, you ain't seen nothing yet, because this can get a whole lot worse very fast. So that's, I think, a major strategic miscalculation, based above all else, I think, on a misunderstanding of the fragility of the state system in the Middle East. I have absolutely no patience with Mr. Putin, who's a Michael Corleone of the international system. But you can't really deny that he had the better of the argument at the United Nations General Assembly the other day. Because what the president said was, well, he condemned Russia, he condemned Iran, he condemned China, and then he said to Russia and Iran, can you help me sort out Syria? And he admitted that we had created a vacuum of power in Libya by getting rid of Gaddafi, and then concluded the speech by saying, can we now get rid of Assad? Putin won the debate hands down by making the point that we have created, we the United States and our allies have created state failure in Iraq and in Libya And by kind of half intervening, but not wholly intervening in Syria, we've done it there even more. This is a mess. Please let me stress, a mess partly made by the Bush administration. I've been criticizing US foreign policy since 2003, I guess, when I started to write about it seriously. And I was as critical of Bush as I have been of Obama. It's possible to be against both, you know. And we got ourselves, as a result, into a strategic mess that will be very hard to sort out. Very hard indeed for the next president. Henry Kissinger is 92. I think he's a little old to call back into office. What's startling to me is how few substitutes are visible. When you look at the people who advised President Obama, the striking thing about them is their experience of US law rather than of international relations. He has never had a strong and well-qualified national security advisor, in my view, with all due respect to the people who've held that post. And that is one reason I think the strategy has gone awry. It's kind of made it itself. That was the 5-minute answer. I suspect I'll be writing on this subject in the newspapers over the coming days and weeks, because it's the easiest way to interest people in the book about, about the distant past. Let me take the gentleman there in the t-shirt, and then gentleman towards the back in the blue jacket. Yes, sir.
So, Kissinger is obviously a very complex character, and I'm just wondering, in Cambodia, for example, sometimes he's credited with helping destroy Cambodia. And I'm wondering if that's true, and if that makes him a truly morally flawed person whom we can't respect, but we have to respect him anyway because of the great things he did elsewhere.
This is a volume 2 question.
Most of them are so far.
Right. And I really want to be clear that I'm not going to be able to give you an unequivocal answer to any volume 2 question when I'm still in the midst of the research, when I haven't plowed through the documents, when I haven't done my due diligence. It would be really irresponsible of me to give an answer. So, at the risk of sounding lame, give me 3 years. I think the right way to address these questions, here I'll show you my hypotheses, the working hypotheses for volume 2, although, like any hypothesis I start with, like American Machiavelli, it can be gone in a day. Right. The working hypothesis for volume 2 is that a strategy evolved which was focused on extricating the US from Vietnam, achieving some kind of control over the arms race with the Soviets, and exploiting the Soviet-Chinese split to further both these objectives. If those were the overarching goals, there were a bunch of subordinate goals, like I mentioned earlier, kicking the Soviets out of the Middle East, trying to prevent Soviet influence expanding in other third world regions. Below that level, you get into a series of crises that are of second or third order significance. The books that have been written about the undoubted disasters that occurred in the Nixon and Ford administrations, think of Bangladesh as well as Cambodia, or think of what happened in Chile, tend to focus on those particular cases without ever asking the question, what was the strategic framework within which this happened, and what were the priorities that led to these decisions? As I said earlier, the intellectual Kissinger, the professor, says most decisions will be between evils. The challenge is to rank them and make sure you choose the lesser. So I think what I want to set out to do in volume 2 is show that that was the approach. And also to show that the situation of the United States in 1969, when they came into office, was dire. Part of the challenge of writing history is to unknow what came next. We all know how the Cold War ended. So we tend, with hindsight now, to underrate the Soviet Union. We also know that the US economy rallied in the 1980s. So we tend to forget how fragile it looked in the Nixon years. So in volume 2, I want to try and explain the strategy and show that they started from an incredibly weak position. And as far as Cambodia is concerned, there do seem to me to be interesting parallels with the drone strikes against Pakistan. The technology is different because we have far more precise technology now. But the goal of trying to attack an enemy's supply lines of communication from the air is basically the same. So that's a very half-baked answer, but frankly, it's a half-baked book I haven't written.
Thank you.
Gentleman with the blue jacket.
Yes, two questions. Your characterization of Kissinger's thinking about freedom back in the late 40s, it sounds like, I know he understood Kant, but it sounds like he was highly influenced by possibly Sartre at that time, who was front and center at that time. In your readings, did you find any of that?
It's fascinating because there are some points of contact. He cites Sartre in his senior thesis, misspelling the name, which I think tells you that it wasn't a big part of the undergraduate reading. Like all young, ambitious academic types, he wanted everything in the footnotes, even things that one suspects he hadn't read as deeply as Kant. Later, as the editor of a short-lived magazine called Confluence, Kissinger wrote seeking contribution. This was a kind of commentary type magazine that they tried to set up at Harvard, associated with the international seminar that he ran each summer. And it was one of those magazines that sort of limped along with money from the Ford Foundation before finally petering out. Very interesting to see from whom he solicits contributions. He writes to Camus and asks Camus if he'll write an essay on the problem of collaboration in an occupied country. This was an issue that Kissinger spent a lot of time thinking about. The moral problem of how to act if you are in an enemy-occupied regime. Camus didn't write the essay, so Kissinger had to fall back on this illustrious names. But my answer to your question is that he was clearly interested in many of the currents of French philosophical thought at that time. He read widely in French as well as in German and English. His Europe was very much a Europe composed of Germany, France, a little bit of Italy, and the UK. He hardly ever paid attention to other European countries. But I would say that the real focus of his reading was not on existentialism. And those people who sought to find that in his writing have probably read a bit too much into it.
The other
Yes.
question is your ratio you're talking about. How did that work out with your 2-volume masterpiece on the Rothschilds?
This book resembles closely the history of the Rothschild family that I wrote in the 1990s. I've always wanted to write a book on that scale again and to grapple with the kinds of challenges that come with archival research, particularly research in archives that haven't really been used before. And of course, it's another chapter in a way in the history of the Jews. I'm not a Jew myself, but I've written, it seems, a lot about Jewish history, and this was a chance to write some more on that subject. I think methodologically these books will be very similar, both in 2 volumes, both covering a pretty long time sweep, both attempting to dig deeply into archival sources, and both trying to challenge a pretty powerful mythology. The Rothschild book begins with the myth of the Rothschilds, which was a very extraordinary thing in itself, a very colourful, often vicious anti-Semitic mythology that centered around their supposedly massive international financial and political power. Part of it was the Nazi film Die Rothschild, but that was just the culmination of probably a century of anti-Rothschild propaganda. There is a similarity here because a lot of the things written about Kissinger have a similar overwrought quality. And I'm still pondering why it is that of all the secretaries of state since World War II, he is the one who has attracted the most criticism, the most ferocious diatribes. there's something odd about that. Because when you look at the record, it's not as if the Nixon administration was the only administration ever to be accused of, say, regime change, of supporting authoritarian governments, of turning a blind eye to acts of violence by allies, to using or contemplating the use of assassination. This was standard fare in the 1950s. So I'm struggling a bit to understand where the trial of Dean Rusk is in the line. You take a look around book passage, you will not find many books accusing Lyndon Johnson of being a war criminal. But it seems to me there's something odd there. And one possible explanation, which I touch on in the introduction to this book, is that as an outsider, as a Jew, Henry Kissinger has become a lightning rod for some of the same curious animosity that the Rothschilds in the 19th century aroused. That's not to say crudely, it's all anti-Semitism. Clearly that's not the case, and would be hard to use to explain the hostility of Seymour Hersh. But there's something going on there which I don't quite get. At the very least, there's a double standard. We seem to have a very different approach when we're thinking about Egypt's 2015 and Chile 1973. And I think if nothing else, people who want to bandy about terms like war crime need to be consistent and recognize that makes for an awful lot of criminals in the history of US foreign policy. I can't remember who's next in the batting order, but
gentleman over
we
there.
definitely need to take a woman next. Otherwise, I'm going to have all sorts of Harvard issues when I go home. So there's a lady in there, and there's another, I think that's another female question there, so let me try and get the gender balance right. Yes, please.
I wanted to make 3 comments.
Mm.
One is, from a point of view of a 10, 11, 12, 13-year-old, was that he was a good friend of my dad's. He spent the weekends at our house discussing foreign policy because my dad was in that field. And I totally recognize the person you're describing, the moral philosophy and the agonizing about moral choices, and the focus on that seemed to me to be deeply part of every conversation. So I feel grateful to you for writing about that. And I'm interested in what the next piece is, because I don't necessarily perceive the next phase of his life was similar, but I absolutely recognize that. The other comment is, I do think he faced a lot of anti-Semitism always. I mean, not just in 1938, but through the period that this was described, that the foreign policy establishment was very WASP, and he very much integrated into it, and must have had a cost to him on a personal level. And the third comment was that I think that some of the rage that came towards him was not just because, the anti-Semitism of the American heartland or not heartland, whatever that is, that he had a foreign accent, he was Jewish, whatever, xenophobia, but I think it was also a sense of betrayal from the elites who thought he was one of them. And he would represent them and not make them feel ashamed when he was in power. So I think there was this very personal animosity that went towards him because I don't want to think you're one of me anymore, from the people who he was closely connected to, and then a different kind of animosity from people that would naturally see him as an enemy. So
Thanks.
on both sides, it's a tough one.
Those are 3 interesting points, and I'm very, very grateful to you for adding your own personal recollections to my database. That's really interesting. We should perhaps talk about who your father was offline. The anti-Semitism is definitely there. In 1964, Kissinger is at the Republican National Convention in San Francisco, just down the road from here, and he sees the Barry Goldwater supporters in full spate, bowing and jeering at Nelson Rockefeller, who was Kissinger's patron, whom Kissinger advised through 3 unsuccessful bids for the Republican nomination. And Kissinger's notes, his little diary of that Republican convention, are perfect evidence for what you just said. Because to him, this conservative mob, unruly but in fact in some measure orchestrated at the campaign, reminds him of the 1930s. And he writes that. He says there's a fascist quality to this. So that's clearly there. There's a moment at this convention, which sticks in my memory, when one of the Goldwater supporters, who's kind of noting down the names of people, says, Kissinger, we know who you are. And that absolutely chills his blood. So there's no question that part of what goes on as Kissinger becomes the object of right-wing criticism, and that continues and intensifies in the 1970s when not only are people critical of being taught, but there starts to be this right-wing conspiracy view that he's actually a communist agent. I mean, there's a whole bunch of crazy books and articles alleging this. That is definitely rooted in what you describe, an anti-Semitism. The issue of what makes people turn so bitterly against him after '68 is a complicated one. I'll tell a brief version of my view by talking about how his former colleagues at Harvard behaved. There's this great moment of repudiation when Thomas Schelling and a group of other Harvard faculty trooped down to Washington with the Harvard Crimson in attendance in order very publicly to denounce him for the Nixon administration's policy in Cambodia. And they do this despite the fact that he's their former colleague, and he had been on friendly relations with most of the people who came on that trip. And he was very shocked by their behavior. He expected they were going to have a lunch and a discussion, and they kind of march in and denounce him. I was trying to work out what was going on there when it suddenly struck me, partly from reading the Harvard Crimson's report. I have to say these guys were covering their backs. At a time when the student protests were intensifying on the Harvard campus as well as on other campuses. I mean, there was actually a bomb that went off in the Center for International Affairs at Harvard in, I think, 69 or 70. So things were getting pretty hot. One of the participants in the anti-Kissinger protests from Harvard had come from a faculty meeting that had been entirely concerned with student unrest. And since many of the people on that trip had themselves been in government during the escalation of the Vietnam War, I mean, they'd been in the National Security Council, some of these people, I have to conclude that there was a certain amount of very public insurance being taken out. That by distancing themselves from Nixon and Kissinger, they were kind of aligning themselves with the student left and hoping that nobody would notice that in fact the escalation of the Vietnam War had been on their watch. So that strikes me as important. There's a tendency to forget today. Some of you were around, so you will remember, but my students have no clue how incredibly turbulent the United States was in 1968, 69, 70. Incredible turbulence. We had no real idea unless we were there. When you go back and look at the race riots at that time, the student protests at that time, what we've seen in our time, whether it's Ferguson, Missouri, or the Occupy movement, pales into insignificance. It was warlike in some of the big American cities. It was absolutely extraordinary what happened even on the relatively sedate Harvard campus. So I think anybody trying to understand what it was like to be in government in 1969 has to begin with this extraordinary turmoil. And those people who wanted very publicly to distance themselves from Nixon, I think had more than just altruistic motives in doing so.
Time for just one more? Was there somebody you'd already picked out?
Well, I think there's another female question at the back, and I'm sorry if we didn't get to everybody. I never quite managed that. I should give shorter answers.
Well, there was an editorial in the Guardian newspaper a couple of years ago criticizing John Kerry's diplomatic mistakes, and the author said really sincerely that he longed for the days of Kissinger. words I never thought I'd read in The Guardian. So I'm wondering if you think there's been a reevaluation lately in the popular culture.
It's certainly pretty unusual to get anything positive said about Kissinger in the Guardian newspaper, or for that much about me. I think there is a process of reassessment going on. If Henry Kissinger were a stock, he would have bottomed out around the time that Christopher Hitchens wrote his book. And I think the rally in the stock begins with our realizing that President Obama wouldn't be able to bring universal peace and brotherhood by simply giving nice speeches. I sense that we are gradually recognizing that it's not as easy as it looks. And we had the happy feeling that everything could be blamed on the Bush administration and made good by simply electing the anti-Bush. I think for a while that was Obama's strategy, just being something other than W. As time has gone on, this administration has encountered some really intractable problems, of which Syria is probably going to be the biggest. And it's at moments like this, as Putin runs rings around the president, that we start to think, even Guardian readers, wouldn't it be nice if we had somebody who could outsmart Putin? And maybe to outsmart Putin, you can't be an idealist. I want to leave you with this final thought. Towards the end of this volume, I tried to suggest that Kissinger was beginning to see the limits of idealism. The lines that he'd taken on the Berlin crisis, on Cuba, on Vietnam in the early 60s, looked unsustainable when confronted with the problems of Vietnam that he saw at first hand when he went there in 1965-66. And so he begins to think, gee, how to get out of this mess? I'm going to have to at least take something from the Bismarck playbook. I've got to start being a little bit more strategically subtle, otherwise we're simply never going to extricate ourselves. So I think what I'm trying to leave you with and the reader with is the sense that towards the mid and late 1960s, Kissinger went through a really difficult intellectual reassessment that planted some of the seeds that would later sprout once he entered the Nixon White House. Nixon, of course, will loom very large in the first part of Volume 2. One should never lose sight of the fact that he was the president, not Henry Kissinger. And in a sense, much of the early decision-making, not least over Cambodia, which you mentioned, really came from Nixon. Nixon was the architect of Vietnamization. Kissinger was against rapid troop withdrawals in Vietnam. He thought this would simply encourage the North Vietnamese to toughen their line, and that, I suspect, he wasn't wrong. So this is, as you say, a complicated story. It's a relief to me that occasionally even the hardliners, the arch-liberals of The Guardian, consider the possibility that Kissinger was something other than Dr. Evil. I think he was something far more than the Dr. Evil Christopher Hitchens portrayed. As I said at the beginning, I'm only sorry that Hitch isn't around to review this book. I have a suspicion that because he was a contrarian himself, he might just have appalled his friends by giving it a good review. Thanks very much.
Thanks everybody. If you've got a book, please come up the center aisle. If you want